So, guys, I might have created a simulation of redemption. It plays virtual games of redemption and keeps track of some metadata. So, before I get into the code, let me to give you some context. So, if you've watched my channel at all during the last week, you know that I've been really enjoying this Gospel of Christ Good Stuff deck. Like Lightning McQueen, I am speed. And that deck is all about getting Matthew, the publican, into play on the first turn of the game. And so when you're building a deck based around Matthew, the natural question you may have in your mind is, what's the best way I can build my deck to optimize getting Matthew into play on turn one? So for example, you have to ask yourself, how many tutors do I want to include? There's so many. There's Reassuring Angel, Angel of the Winds, Angel of the Sun, Patmos, Priest of Christ. But when do you start to ask yourself, how many tutors is too many tutors? Or let's say you want to put a hopper in your deck and you're curious about how is that going to affect my ability to get Matthew into play on turn one? Or if you're really wanting to go all in, you're asking yourself, how effective are the Grumbled and Shepherd's Lost Souls at actually getting Matthew into play? Are they useful? Are they helpful? And maybe you're curious about how does the size of the deck affect my ability to get Matthew into play on turn one? So these are all questions kind of floating in my mind. And lastly, you also want to see if you want to put Virgin Birth in your deck to see how effective it is at helping you find Matthew or your tutors. You may have watched a Z Temple video where he goes into an online calculator and calculates probabilities. So for example, he's like, okay, I have a 43 card size deck, 8 heroes in my deck. What's the chance I can find one hero? And he's using this hypergeometric calculator to give him percentages. But I feel like the territory we're going to go right now is a little bit beyond the domain of hypergeometric calculators. So what I propose to you right now is I'm going to go inside, lock myself in a room, and play the game of redemption by myself, goldfish it like a solitaire game. And I'm just going to keep doing this over and over and over again. And the idea is when I play my deck over and over again, I get a really good sense of how often I can play Matthew on turn one. So for example, I could build my deck, I put 50 cards in it, I put the Virgin Birth, I put a hopper in it, and then I just play 1,000 games by myself. At the end of it all, I keep track of how many times I was able to draw and play Matthew on turn one. Does that sound like a fun idea? It's doable, and I certainly wouldn't have a very big life if I did that. Here's my other idea. What if I make the computer do it? Okay, so what I have here is a program I built in Python. It's a simulation that takes a bunch of parameters like the number of simulations you want to do, the size of the deck you want to try, the number of cycler lost souls, and that if you're going first or second in the game. And so it takes all these parameters, puts them into a simulation class, and runs some code to simulate the game. So I'm not going to go through all the code, but I just wanted to give you guys like a high level idea of what I was trying to do here. So I'm going to be doing this over and over and over again. First part of my turn, I draw 8 cards, do any Virgin Birth effects if the Virgin Birth is in my deck, and then we'll take a turn. And at the end of the turn, we'll do a log and see if we've got Matthew in play. Turn 1. So here's some of the logic for the take a turn. Have some handling to draw 3 cards if we're not going first. And also continue to do the logic for handling the Virgin Birth if it's one of the cards you drew in the first 3 cards that you drew. And as you can see, I also have the logic to handle any lost souls. Now don't be confused by this word MacGuffin. It's like a word used in movies, but we're trying to find Matthew. Matthew is our MacGuffin. And so I have some logic here to grab Matthew out of my hand and put him into my territory. And at the end of the day, I'm appending to a log file that tells me if I've got Matthew in my territory. I'm doing this over and over and over and over and over and over again until I generate something that looks like this. So this plot here, I take all those logs, I calculate a percentage. So let's take a look at the baseline heat map of Game of Redemption. Let's learn how to interpret this. So for this spot, we see the number of cycler lost souls is 0. The number of tutors is also 0. And so out of a million games, 18.6% of those million games was able to play Matthew on turn 1. Now as the number of tutors increases in our deck, go from 0 all the way up to 8, our chances go from getting Matthew in play on turn 1 from 18.6 to all the way up to 87.48. Just to let you know, right, these parameters right here we have 50 cards in the deck. This deck does not have the Virgin Birth, it does not have the hopper, and we are going first, which means we're not drawing 3 cards on the first turn of the game. So this is the baseline. And how to read these additional columns, you can interpret this number is the percentage of games out of a million that were run where we were able to play Matthew on turn 1, and Let me pause for a second and just re-clarify this. I was watching the VOD again, and I wanted to just make sure this point was clear. So each one of these squares represents 1,000,000 games. And out of those 1,000,000 games, this is the percent that Matthew was going to play on turn 1. If there's 8 tutors and there's 3 different sets of testing for the cycler lost souls, that means each of these graphs you see here is 24 million games in total were simulated. For this column, we had 0 tutors and 1 cycler lost soul. Yeah, and I also wanted to clarify that the cycler lost souls, these are these lost souls. And as you can see, as we increase the number of cycler lost souls, our chances of getting Matthew in play on turn 1 are increased just a little bit. So this was like 18.6, 18.96, 19.42. So the more cycler lost souls that we add into our deck, the better chance we get of actually finding Matthew and playing him on turn 1. So that makes sense. And this also makes sense that as we increase the number of tutors, cards that search for Matthew, it also increases our chances of finding him and playing him dramatically. So this is our baseline. What I'm going to be doing now is comparing heat maps generated for the Virgin Birth and the Hopper in the deck and comparing that to the baseline. So here's a heat map for the Virgin Birth. And so I'm going first. I'm not having the Hopper, 50 cards in the deck, and I have Virgin Birth. And so you see these numbers right here are the positive differential between this number and the number here. If I have 0 tutors in the deck and I have 0 cycler lost souls, but I include the Virgin Birth in one of my 50 cards, there's going to be approximately a 1.52% increase in effectiveness. And this number changes as we change the number of souls around and the number of tutors. But I approximated it was adding the Virgin Birth to your deck gave you a positive increase of getting Matthew into play by approximately 2.5% based upon these assumptions. And then I did the same thing for the Hopper. I said, okay, I'm going first. I have the Hopper in my deck. I don't have Virgin Birth. What's the approximate percentage increase of times I'm going to be able to play Matthew on turn 1? So you'll see these numbers. I'm getting a little bit better percentage of the time, but it's not as dramatic as the Virgin Birth. So I kind of rounded this. If I add a Hopper to my deck, depends upon the number of tutors I have, but maybe if I have 4 tutors in my deck and I add Hopper, I'm going to see approximately a 1% increase in games where I do get to play Matthew on turn 1. Okay, so let's think about this other scenario where you're sitting down with your opponent and you get to draw 3 cards because you get to go second. So how does that affect the probability of getting your Matthew into play on turn 1? Well, like I said, depends on the number of cycler lost souls and the number of tutors in your deck. As you can see, drawing those 3 cards increases our chance of getting Matthew into play around 12.5%, depending upon exactly what your deck configuration is. So let's just say we have 1 cycler lost soul in the deck and we have 4 tutors. We can expect approximately 79.9% of the time to get Matthew into play. And that's 12.72% greater than if we were just going first and we didn't draw those 3 cards. Okay, so we've been looking at all these charts. They're really pretty and stuff, but I want to bring it back down to earth a little bit. Let's take a look at some changes I'm thinking of making to the Gospel of Christ Good Stuff deck. I'm trying to compete in the Lackey Grand Prix, and I want to make some adjustments to the deck, and I want to see how my adjustments affect the chances of me getting Matthew into play down early. So let's take a look here. Here's the original deck list, and the things that I've circled in red, these are the tutor cards. So if you count, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I'm kind of counting these 3 as 1 because Spirit is a Dove, you have to have a Clay Hero out. You can use it to go grab your Matthew, or if you have your New Covenant out, you can use your New Covenant to grab your Spirit as a Dove from your deck, then to play it and play Matthew. So I'm kind of counting these as 1. I originally thought you could do Delivered, go activate New Covenant, and then New Covenant grab this, but since these are both territory class, you can only play 1 of them per turn. In my mind, I'm counting these as 1 tutor. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tutors. They have 1 cycler lost soul, and then the Hopper. The changes I want to make, I want to only have 1, 2, 3 tutors and the Virgin Birth. And so when I run the simulation with the certain parameters, so these are the parameters of the original, and these are the parameters of my deck, I end up with this. So out of the 1,000,000 games that were played with these parameters, 88.63% of them had Matthew in play on turn 1, and of the 1,000,000 games I played with this, only 72.53% had Matthew in play on turn 1 here. So that's quite the negative drop here, and it made me realize maybe I should add a tutor back in. So let me try bumping that back up to 4, and 88.63% versus 80.53%. So I believe adding the angel back in is actually good. I'm changing my odds from getting Matthew down by probably like 8%. And these are just estimates. Like, I don't know if objectively if 88.63% is going to be better than 80.53%. I don't know. I like round numbers, and having that consistency of like 80% on the play seems really, I don't know, that's a good starting point, I guess. And so if you've liked this project and you want to go look at the code for yourself, take a look at my GitHub. It's a link in the description, because I have some more ideas. How would I implement having a 4 drachma coin in the deck or denarius? And how is that going to affect my consistency? But certainly being able to draw more cards if you get these cards is really nice, and it's going to make your deck more consistent. And so the numbers I showed you, those percentages are probably going to go up once we factor these into play. I also have some future ideas about different types of questions I can ask. Instead of asking how often can I get Matthew on turn 1, I could easily modify the simulation to instead ask the question, how often can I block on turn 1? It's going to probably take the number of evil characters, number of ways you can get them on turn 1, lost soul effects. I'm also interested to see what kind of questions you guys have. Given a program like this, what do you think would be interesting questions to look at? So comment down below if you have any. Maybe I'll implement them.